I am delighted to feature two incredible researchers who are from Australia and New Zealand, or at least based right now in Australia and New Zealand, to share their research that they have been conducting or that they conducted as a part of their doctoral research. And so with that, I am going to invite Dr. Julie Choisne to share her screen and share with us the amazing research that she presented initially at ISB this year.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie. I'm a senior research fellow at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute. And I presented that work at ISB this year. But this work was done mainly by Yi-Dan Zhu. She's a PhD student with me, but she is writing her thesis to be submitted at the end of this month. So I will present on her behalf. So part of our PhD was to develop a statistical shape and density model of the pediatric femur and tibia to be used for finite models. So to build good subject-specific finite models, there are a few things that you need. So first is a good volumetric mesh that have a good mesh quality index, performed a mesh sensitivity analysis. The second one is to have a patient-specific geometry that usually comes from medical imaging. And the third one is to have patient-specific material properties, which usually comes from calibrated CT scans. And here's an example of how people have used CT scans in the clinic and making finite models automatically from medical imaging. And the fourth one is boundary condition. So you can use in vivo instrumented implant information, or if you want to do it more personalized, you can use musculoskeletal modeling. Now, what happens if you don't have medical imaging for your participant or your patient? Well, people have developed in the recent years statistical shape and density or appearance models. And this has been used for in silico clinical trials because you can see the variation of shape and bone mineral density in a population. So you can use or test your implants on a wide range of population. But they also have the potential to predict personalized bone geometry and material properties. And so FE models can be generated from these statistical shape and density models to understand how density and shape variation affect load transfer with respect to surgical treatments. However, it's never been tried on children. And we all know that children are not small adults. So part of our previous work was to look at how statistical shape models can predict bone shape and how it can be used in musculoskeletal models and how different it is from open sim models that use generic adults. We also looked at how bone mineral density distribution change in children with age and how it affects regional bone mineral density differently. So using that knowledge, he then decided to create and validate a pediatric statistical shape and density model of the femur and tibia for a population of children aged 4 to 18 years old. So she wanted to assess the capability of this model to accurately predict the three-dimensional shape of the femur and tibia by using only demographic and linear bone measurements, and also assess the accuracy to predict bone mineral density at the element level in your volumetric mesh and also at the regional level for that population. So the population we used was 333 children aged from 4 to 18 years, and you can see the distribution of age, height, and mass for these children. We had a full body CT scan, so we were able to have the right and the left femurs and tibia. So we ended up with a total of 657 femora and 652 tibiae to build our model. So first, we need to get the geometry out of these CT scans. So we perform manual segmentation in Mimics. followed by a surface mesh fitting using radial basis function. So it means that any nodes on the surface of the femur or the tibia correspond to the same anatomical location for all femurs and all tibias. And then we created a tetrahedral volumetric template mesh following sensitivity analysis. And we performed host mesh fitting to all the femora and tibiae. So all the femurs, all their nodes had the same anatomical location, and same for the tibia. The next step was to extract the bone mineral density information from the CT scans, and we were very lucky to have a calibration phantom in these CT scans where we could correlate the Huntsville unit to the known density in the phantom, and then we could calibrate the entire bone. And we used bone mat to put the bone mineral density from the CT scan to our volumetric mesh. So now that we have all our femurs shape and density and all our tibia shape and density, we align all the bones together and we perform what we call principal component analysis. So principal component analysis can look at the variation in your entire data set. So looking at the node-to-node differences in terms of XYZ location and also in terms of bone mineral density. And the next step, if you want to predict from outside of your data set, you can use partial least square regression, and you can use any input for prediction. In this case, we used age, height, mass, sex, and linear bone measurements are input. So linear bone measurements were the bone height and bone width, either the knee or the ankle. And we looked how good we were in predicting new bones in a leave one out analysis. So we perform a PCA on n-1 cases, and then we predicted with our PLSR on the 1 cases left out. And we did that for all of the children. And so what happens is that the PLSR, I kind of forgot, output the different PC weights from the PCA. And then you can use the mean shape to reconstruct your bone. So your new femur on your new tibia from your new patient. So to evaluate our statistical shape and density model, we looked at the fitting error. So the work mean square distance between the nodes, between the CT scan segmented bone and the host mesh fitted bone. And then for our leave one out analysis, we looked how good we predicted a new bone geometry and bone mineral density by looking at the node-to-node distance, again, between the CT scan segmented and the statistical shape and density model predicted bone. And we also compared element to element bone mineral density and the average bone mineral density per region. So looking at the results in terms of mesh quality, if you remember at the beginning, I said it was quite important. And one thing that I wasn't sure is that how the hot mesh fitting would keep the quality of the mesh. And also, once you predict, do you still keep that same quality? And we were happy to see that we never developed any negative Jacobian in our elements. And we had a very good mesh quality with a quality index around 1.5, which is what between 1 and 3, which is what you want. Looking at the results of the principal component analysis, so looking at the variation of shape and density in our data set, if we look at the femurs, the first principal component accounted for about 50% of the variation in shape and density. And here on this figure, you can see that's what the bone looked like at -2 standard deviation in that first principal component. And that's what the bone looked like at +2 standard deviation in that same component. So you can see the quite big difference between the two bones. And so the -2 standard deviation is very small. The +2 standard deviation is quite big. So we can assume that age is quite correlated with that first principal component. And we can see also how the features at the proximal and distal end of the bone is quite different for the two. So the young bones doesn't have a greater trochanter yet, or a lesser trochanter, doesn't have very well-defined condyles compared to the older bone. And same for the cross-section at the mid shaft. You can see that younger bones have a rounded type of shaft, while it's more ellipsoid once you grow to a more 18 years old. If we look at the second principal component, so the second mode of variation, which accounted for 7% of variation in the data set, the difference between the -2 standard deviation and the +2 standard deviation is mostly about that antiversion angle or the rotation of that femur, which shows that that is one of the biggest variation in the data set or as a population as well. And then you can look at how the density changed because of that antiversion angle. And then PC4, I skipped PC3, wasn't very interesting, but PC4, which accounts about 4% of the total variation in the data set, was mostly into the difference in bone mineral density in that shaft, so that cortical thickness and endocortical surface. Now looking at the tibia, and I'll concentrate only on the first principal component as it's the most interesting. So again, the -2 standard deviation and the +2 standard deviation in that first principal component, which accounted for 43% of variation. You can see how the shape changed quite dramatically, especially the plateau that changed from convex to actually flat. And here you don't really have a malleoli yet at the ankle. And looking at the 25%, 50%, and 75% of the shaft, and you compare the two, you can see that you have a big change in shape between the two, with a tuberosity that appears later in life. And we also looked at that +2 standard deviation and highlighted the bone mineral density. And you can see that you've got an increase in bone mineral density at some places, which is similar if you map the muscle insertions. So that's the muscle contributing to that bone mineral density. Now, if we look at that, our prediction error. So first, our feeding error were pretty good, less than 1 millimeter. And when we look at the shape prediction error, so if we predict a new participant's bone, we are less than 2 millimeters accurate in terms of root mean square error. So we were quite happy with that. But in terms of bone mineral density, we looked at the normalized root mean square error, and we were quite high, about 30%. When you look at element to element root mean square error. But when you look at that regional bone mineral density, so average femoral head of that predicted bone and average femoral head bone mineral density of that CT scan, you can see that we are less than 14% in average in prediction error, with the shaft having the lowest error in bone mineral density. So at the end, we've got an automatic process that can give you a good volumetric mesh with a reasonable mesh quality and no negative Jacobian. We got personalized geometry, which is in line with our previous work on statistical shape model. And in terms of material properties, our element-to-element comparison lacks some accuracy, but when you look at the more regional bone mineral density, we had less than 15% normalized root mean square error. Now, our future work was to look at the effect of partial or full imaging information. So if you have a full bone MRI or partial CT information, can you use it to make the prediction a bit better? So Yedan is working on that. She got some preliminary results. But she looked at full fitting if you have the information about the shape and the density, partial fitting if you only have 15% of your proximal and distal end of the bone, and the PLSR is the one that I just showed. And so we've seen this one in terms of here root mean square error in distance, root mean square error in density. And so the use of partial or full fitting does reduce our prediction in terms of shape and also in terms of density in the femur. And we've seen the same trend in the tibia. So even with partial imaging, you quite drastically reduced the error. And also we looked at the angular measurement errors. Neck shaft angle, anteversion angle, and tibial torsion. We were pretty bad with our PLSR, but with the partial and full fitting, we were able to reduce this error quite a lot. So I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors, the funders, IWB for inviting me to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Schwen. That was really interesting. Are there any questions? Feel free to either unmute yourself or put your question in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it out loud.
I have a quick question.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to ask, with the population of children that you were looking at, did you have much information about like kind of what loading patterns they'd gone through? Because like we know that, like, say adolescents who swim versus run versus all of those things, it's never ending. Did you by chance, were you lucky enough to have any of that?
No, so these were postmortem CT scans. So we don't have any information on their what they did as kids, unfortunately.
That makes sense. It's still amazing work though. So.
Thanks.
To sort of build on that question though, did you have an overall assessment of their general bone health, such as a DEXA scan, or just to kind of have that knowledge of how normative is this population? Obviously, kids are never normative.
We don't have DEXA scans, but you can look at how active they were in terms of muscle mass. So it's a CT scan, so you have the overall muscle mass that you can correlate with cortical thickness, for example. So you could do that, yeah.
And then with your sort of future work looking at those partial scans, do you see a route where we would be able to estimate this, not necessarily from CT scans, but even just from the information we can gain from x-rays?
Yeah, I think you could do a lot. Some people on the adult population for osteoporosis, especially, they use DEXA scan to get some information on bone mineral density and some information on the shape. So that could be as well. To be honest, where I'm going there is more like a pre-surgery tool. So usually they do have some partial imaging before they go through surgery, but yeah, anything would be possible. We've also developed musculoskeletal models just from the markers. So you don't have the density, but you can estimate the shape as well.
With estimating the shape, because this could go toward that direction of then kind of pre-surgical and surgical planning, do you find that there are any differences in accuracy of the shape prediction when you're looking at the external morphology versus that internal morphology, such as the medullary canal?
That's work that I'm doing on the side. Another PhD student looking at doing a body scan of the child and then try to predict the bones inside from that body scan. But yeah, but it's work in progress. But yeah, everything is possible, right? There are some full body statistical shape models that anyone can use, so you can do that as well.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions for Dr. Schwen? All right, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Schwen for such a great presentation. And then we will hear next from Dr. Paige Treherne, who will be presenting some of her late doctoral research, as well as a little bit of a preview into what she's been doing in her postdoctoral research.
Perfect. Okay, that's all displayed well for everyone. I wish she's lovely. Well, yeah, initially, thanks for inviting me to talk today. And as mentioned, so I'll be presenting about how morphology and mobility shape subtalar joint mechanics during increased loading, which was the last study in my PhD. And I did present this work at ISB. And then, yeah, only it'll seem like I finished, but then I'll do a quick little preview on what I'm doing in my postdoctoral work, which is quite different, looking at Paralympic classification. So I thought it'd be a bit of fun to just talk about that really briefly too. So we know that humans exist along or across a broad range of shapes and sizes, and we all complete relatively similar bipedal locomotion. But I guess kind of similar to what Julie said, small adults, children aren't necessarily just smaller adults, but are larger adults just scaled up smaller adults. How does it work within the adult population? So when we look at all the joints in the human body, all of our mass goes through our ankle joint, which is our primary interface with the ground and experiences large cyclical forces due to our bipedal locomotion, which could make it particularly vulnerable to increased size, especially as the articular surfaces of the subtalar joint are quite small. So here we're just looking at a talus from an inferior view and that subtalar articular surface. In addition to this, we know that there's substantial variability within the shape of human ankle joint bones with distinct size-related shape features. So for instance, there's a more cube-like calcaneus as skeletal size increases, which appears to be to offset those increased forces of being larger. But overall, we can say that a larger subtalar joint is not simply a scaled-up, smaller subtalar joint. However, it's currently unclear how the ankle joint and the subtalar joint responds as humans alter their mass or external loading. We know that bones can change shape over time in response to loading, but we also know that humans can change shape quite quickly, and in some cases quicker than bone remodeling can occur. So for instance, through weight gain, pregnancy, or external load carriage. So short term, before this adaptive bone remodeling can occur, we know that the joints are going to be overloaded. So there needs to be some form of strategies to offset these increased forces. And one option here is to alter the posture and motion of the joints. And we know across all three of these populations that they tend to walk with shorter steps and a longer double limb support base. So while we know that skeletal size, shape, and mobility can all influence skeletal loading and stress, it's unknown how these features interact to collectively influence our internal subtalar joint contact mechanics. So the overall aim of this study was to examine how our joint shape, size, and mobility affect subtalar joint contact mechanics under added mass to help provide some insight into how individuals adapt to increased external loading. To do this, we recruited 40 healthy participants across a broad spectrum of heights, and we collected shape information using computer tomography scans, which we then manually segmented and input into our shape analysis. To calculate our internal joint contact mechanics, we collected biplanar video radiography scans of participants during 2 static trials. The first one on the left here is just a participant standing on one leg with all their mass going through their right foot. And then the second trial where we added external mass. So we added a weight vest, which was equivalent to 50% of their body mass. And we did have a live feedback tool to make sure that their knee position and tibial position was the same between those 2 trials. So we could really look at how is the subtalar joint adapting to this increased load. From these scans, we can then track the position of the subtalar joint bones. And when we combine this with our shape information, we can calculate our subtalar joint kinematics during each trial, which we then are able to use to calculate our internal joint contact mechanics measures. When we're talking about posture and mobility, so we defined these using morphological coordinate systems. So we defined posture as the calcaneus coordinate system relative to the talus coordinate system. And for mobility, we define this as the change in our posture from our one body weight to our added mass trial. So it's just that difference there. And for all of our statistical analysis, we broke mobility up into the XYZ components. So we could really look at the different ways the joint is moving and how that impacts or influences our loading. Now, when it comes to our internal joint contact mechanics, due to the complexities of calculating joint reaction forces and center of pressures, especially given the assumptions required by our data, so we don't have any cartilage information here, we have CT scans and X-ray scans essentially, we used kinematic proxies for our center of pressure and joint reaction force direction. So to calculate these, we find distances between our bones in their trial position. So what we do is we create a distance field around the calcaneus and calculate the distance between that bone and every single point on our subtalar articular facet. So you can see here in that top left, we have highlighted the articular surface area and we're working with meshes here. So it's essentially a bunch of triangles. So what we do is we weight each triangle proportional to its own area and inversely proportional to the distance from that triangle to the calcaneus bone. So you can see we end up with a bit of a heat map here. And then we calculate our minimized weighted distance. So this minimizes the distance to all other triangles on the surface and is then biased towards triangles that are closer to the calcaneus. And this is our joint contact center location, or our proxy for our center of pressure. To find the average orientation of the articular surface in each trial, we calculated the normal vectors of every single triangle, and then we weighted those the same way we did for previously. And then we found our average weighted normal vector, which was what we used for our joint contact center orientation, or our proxy for our joint reaction force direction. So again, to assess how these metrics responded to increased external load, we identified the deviations in these between our two trials and separated them up into our X, Y, and Z components as well. So diving into some results. So just to kind of orient everyone to this figure, we're looking at a talus from an inferior viewpoint, and the dark gray or lightish, darker gray highlighting is the articular surface that we're looking at. So if we zoom in on, obviously where all of our lovely dots are, the gray circle here represents 3 standard deviations of our participants' joint contact center location in our one body weight trial. So that is just the variation that we see in that first trial. Now, all the different colored arrows and dots is every single participant and how they individually responded. So the dot, or the beginning of the line, is their joint contact center location in the one body weight trial, and the arrows pointing to where their joint contact center location was in the 1.5 body weight trial. So we can obviously see a really large spread here, with some dots not even having an arrow because it was in the same place versus others going quite far. But one thing that is really important to note here is that this is quite a small area on the articular surface. This gray circle accounts for about 5% of our entire surface. So while there is a lot of variability happening, it does appear to be quite small. So, suggesting that the subtalar joint loading remains quite constant under added mass. And when we look at something similar, similar setup, but for our joint contact center orientation, so you can see the talus on the right-hand side, they're showing all of the arrows. So again, our proxy for our joint reaction force. Again, we can see a lot of variation in direction of movement, but again, really quite small movement here, with our average deviation here being about 1 degree. So what we saw was that despite there being variability in our behavior of our contact mechanics under load, the overall deviations were quite small. So suggesting that the subtalar joint, like loading behaviors, are relatively stable when it's put into an overloaded position. But we also wanted to look at, is there a way we can predict if somebody's going to be having large deviations, small deviations, with the data that we had? And we found that our primary inversion-eversion axis of the subtalar joint was the primary predictor for how much people's mechanics changed. So you can see here the purple bone going from the light to the dark, so 1 body weight to 1.5 body weight trial. So that participant's moving into more inversion, where the blue bone is a participant moving back out to a bit of eversion there. And contrary to our hypothesis, we found that increased inversion-eversion magnitude, so regardless of direction, just the magnitude of change, we found that there'd be an increased deviation in all of our joint contact mechanics. So to kind of quickly visualize that, our orange bone here, the person's mobility, or there was really no mobility, their position was very constant between the trials. But you can see the 2 dots there for our contact center location are pretty much on top of each other, where for our green participant, they had more magnitude of change in their actual bone positions and had a large deviation. And it is also important to note, even on the last slide, with these kind of smaller deviations occurring in our contact mechanics, participants were still moving up to 5 degrees in any direction in this joint. So it's not as if the joint itself wasn't moving between our trials. There was definitely some changes there, but everything still remained quite constant. So as I mentioned, contrary to what we thought, our increased mobility did not reduce the deviations in our contact mechanics. And we did find that despite our primary inversion-eversion being our predominant predictor, we did find that shape did have some contributions into our final models. So we found that our principal component 3, which accounted for about 8% of our variation, did also predict how much people change. So with participants closer in shape to the blue bone, so a longer calcaneus and talus and a less curved calcaneal posterior facet, predicted less deviation, where participants close to the orange bone predicted a larger deviation. But again, overall shape contributed quite minimally when it came to our final models. And it was really that primary inversion eversion axis that was a more critical determinant of how mechanics were changing under added load. So in summary of this work, we found that it was that primary axis of the subtalar joint that was the predominant predictor that defined how people were changing. And while our sheep features didn't seem to contribute overly much when it came to these models, it is really crucial to note that shape is inherent in all of our posture and mobility measures, as they were calculated using morphological coordinate systems. So while our shape features don't directly tied to our mechanics, it appears that there's going to be a lot of indirect application there. So overall, we do believe that shape still plays a pretty meaningful role when it comes to our subtalar joint function. So that's where I'm going to end this part of the talk. But I do just want to quickly, again, it's only a single slide, focus on the next bunch of work that I'm doing. So what I just presented was the end of my doctoral thesis. But the new project I'm working on as a postdoc is in Paralympic classification. So it's a bit of a shift from internal joint contact mechanics. But overall, so just a bit of a background, there are 3 different categories of impairment when it comes to the Paralympic Games. We have visual impairments, intellectual impairments, as well as physical impairments. And classification is quite a complex process, especially when it comes to these physical impairments. If we were to just focus on running based events at the Paralympic Games, we can have athletes competing who have missing limbs, whether it be upper or lower body. We also have wheelchair racers. And we also have athletes who would be considered intact, but have other medical conditions, such as impairments in coordination that would impact their ability to perform. So the question is, how do we classify these athletes to, I guess, reach the main goal of classification, which is how do we make it even that the amount that someone's impairments affecting their performance is taken into account. But we want to be careful that we're not doing it performance-based, because if you have an athlete who has a more severe impairment, but they are just an absolutely amazing athlete, we don't want to penalize them because they're performing better than other people with that same level of impairment. So it's a really complex process to figure that out. And really the biggest challenge is athletes who sit on what's referred to as cut points, so between 2 classes. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to focus on our classes T37 and T38. So these are ambulant runners who have coordination impairments. The higher the number, the less impaired an athlete is. So T38 is our least impaired runners that will compete in Paralympic Games, and the T37 is the one just before those. So if you have an athlete that's kind of sitting between these 2 classes, and a classification panel has to decide, well, where are they going to sit? And this is typically at the beginning of someone's more sub-elite career. If you were to place that individual in the T37, so they are the lesser impaired of that cohort, there is a chance that they will be world records broken and they will just completely dominate the field for years. But then alternatively, if you put them in the class where they are now the more impaired of the cohort, there's a chance they'll never even make a nationals competition. So it's quite a tricky process to look at. And if we just have a bit of context of kind of how these different athletes compete, if we look at some results from the Tokyo Olympics, if we look at female 100-meter sprinters, athletes in the T37 ran 13 seconds flat. The T38 was 12:43, so really not much of a difference there compared to our Olympians, where the gold medal was 10:61. And when we look at the male results, these get even closer, with the difference between T37 and 38 being 0.01 of a second. So when it comes to classifying these athletes, it is not really much at the end of the day that's going to be altering in performance. And as I mentioned, there's these classification panels that have to make these decisions, and it's largely subjective in that there is still a protocol that has to be followed, but at the end of the day, it's up to the individuals in the panel to decide, well, we think they should go here. So the project that I'm working on is exploring whether we can use biomechanics to describe how these different athletes are moving, to provide some more objective information about the athletes that classifiers can then use in their decision-making process. So essentially, it's just going to involve us collecting as much data as we can. So to do that, and again, this is going to be around the world. Ideally, we want every Paralympian to have done our data collection. We have paired with a computer vision team to collect 2D data from 8 separate cameras, and they're developing a pose estimation model that we're then validating in our lab as well. But again, we're still in the early phases of this, but the goal is if we can collect how these Olympians or Paralympians are moving, and as many as we can, there's a way we can then kind of feed that into a large language model to start to figure out, is there definitive or objective differences in the way they're moving that can help assist in this decision-making process. So we're still kind of developing all that now, but at the moment we are gearing up for a very large year of data collection in 2026, both around Australia and New Zealand, and then international as far as we can get to. But with that, that's what I'm working on there. Again, I would like to thank IWB for having me today, and also thank my PhD advisors, without whom the whole first part of this talk would definitely not have been possible. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Fantastic, really interesting work. Are there any questions for Dr. Treherne? So my first question is, how long did folks have to get acclimated to that extra mass before data were collected? Just because that is quite a lot of extra mass.
Yeah, it was a lot of extra mass. Not too long. We pretty much had them in their position for their one body weight trial, and then pretty much while they were up on the force plate area, we just then loaded the vest on them and got them pretty quickly to stand in that position. We weren't getting them to stand in what they deemed as natural or comfortable. We did get them to stand with 15 degrees of tibial flexion. So we did have the live feedback tool that they had to match each time. So that was the same position they were in for the first trial. So it wasn't necessarily natural stance for them. And there was not much time to adapt. It was one of those, we had mostly university students who were like, yeah, I can squat half my body mass. And then you put a weighted vest on and it's a very, very different experience because it's quite constricting. But yeah, there wasn't really much time. It was just get it on, get the scan, get it off, pretty much was our process.
And then with using a weighted vest, the distribution of that added mass on the body is very different from someone who has more weight naturally on their body. Do you think that distributing that extra mass along the body more evenly, sort of with those, like, I see every now and then the weighted wristbands or the ankle bands, putting those around the thighs or adding that weight incrementally throughout the body, would that influence the results, do you think?
I think that'd be really interesting. I think if we were getting people to stand in a natural stance, definitely, I think that would make it a much more comfortable situation. I'm not too sure though, given we were so constrictive of how they had to stand, whether no, it definitely would, because if you had, say, someone on the left leg in this trial, I was single leg stance, so their left leg was up, so all of the added mass was going straight onto that right leg. So if you did have someone on the left leg, you would definitely, that wouldn't be going directly down. So I think that would influence it a little bit because there would essentially be more mass in the trial that we did then. But I think the changes would be more minimal though, given we were quite constrained in how they were standing. We were, yeah, very restrictive on that front.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I do have a question, but it's more, if you look at pregnant women, do you think you would see the same variation, or you would see more variation because of, yeah, the laxity?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I think we would see probably a bit more variation. I think there'd be a bit more mobility happening in the joint as well. And especially given that we saw that more mobility led to more deviation. Again, our hypothesis going in was that mobility would be more protective. If someone has a really stiff foot, the force has to figure out where to go. So we thought that would lead to more deviations occurring, but it really was focused on that mobility side. So I definitely think if we, say, had a population of pregnant women who again have more laxity, so one would assume more mobility going in, I think that definitely would have led to more variation or potentially larger variations than what we saw. Because again, we had quite a small amount of deviation overall, but I definitely think that you would see more deviations in those populations.
Thanks.
So with respect to your current and upcoming research, I know that there's a lot to still be figured out and determined, but you brought up computer vision. And
Yes.
so I was curious what role machine learning is having with this ideally very large, complex data set, and what we might do with that generally.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that the computer vision team is doing, so it is all using AI for pose estimation as well. And I guess one big thing they're working on is they already have a model for non-disabled athletes that's being used by like our Queensland Academy of Sport are using that already, but that's obviously trained on a non-disabled population. So one big part of the project is we want to be able to have a model that works on a disabled population, or a really big one that one of the PhD students is working on is people with missing limbs. So she's working on getting the model to recognize that, yep, the arm is finishing. So don't try and find a wrist, or don't try and find an ankle, because a lot of the current models, they're great at what they do, but again, they're on a non-disabled population. So they're doing a lot of work with using AI on that front to help identify that. And they're starting to go through some historical footage as well and see how well it can pick up, when you've got a 100-meter sprint line, can it pick up who has missing limbs, who doesn't, and all this. It's amazing work that they're doing. And then when it comes to our final model to try and figure out, okay, are there certain biomechanical differences between these groups? As far as I'm aware, that will be kind of AI informed as well. It'll be kind of like an AI machine learning model to do that. That's obviously very down the path. We don't have nearly enough data to feed into that right now. But yeah, definitely trying to harness the benefits of AI in terms of, yeah, how well can we pose estimate these individuals, and especially given some of the concerns we have around, say, the current pose estimation is it is trained on non-disabled population who move quite smoothly, but this population doesn't necessarily move smoothly. They will have tremors, they will have jutting between movements. So trying to make sure that what we end up with doesn't smooth or filter that out, because that's the information we really want to see. So yeah, they're doing a lot of work in that space at the moment, which is really great. And I'm definitely keen to kind of get some of that validation data in our lab to see how well it can pick up actual biomechanics, because it's one of those things where kind of looking at it visually, it's like, oh, the skeleton's snapping so nicely. So visually it looks really great. So definitely really keen to kind of dive into okay, how well does it actually compare to a Vicon system tracking the same thing?
Thank you. Are there any more questions for either of our presenters today? Well, then please join me again to thank Dr. Julie Choisne and Dr. Paige Treherne for their incredible research, and also for taking the time to share it with us today.